The panel now is going to be covering the first 1,000 years of the relationship between Christianity and freedom. Our first panel covered the entire world. This panel will cover 1,000 years of intellectual, social, and political history. But you saw how well the marvelous panelists in the first panel did. We have a tough act to follow, but I'm confident that with this distinguished panel, we'll do equally well. The panel now is going to discuss as I say, the contributions of Christianity to freedom in the first 1,000 years of Christian history. And in a way, we will be addressing or trying to correct a blind spot concerning that relationship, which is in a way similar to the blind spot that was discussed in the first panel. In the first panel, there was some discussion, fascinating, informative discussion about the tendency to have a blind spot about Christian persecution today, the extent, the causes of anti-Christian persecution around the world. This panel, in a sense, addresses another blind spot, a blind spot concerning the positive contributions of Christianity to freedom in the early history of Christianity. There tends to be a blind spot, a lack of awareness of the early Christian roots of freedom in early Christian history and the development of freedom and ideas and practices of freedom throughout the history of Christian thought. There is a widespread assumption that ideas of freedom and tolerance were invented by modernity, perhaps by the Enlightenment, perhaps by the Protestant Reformation. There is an assumption that early Christianity contributed nothing or very little to the origins and development of freedom. Archbishop Mamberti already addressed these issues in a wonderful way in his short address this morning, arguing that there were in fact important early Christian contributions to freedom. And this panel will go much deeper on that issue. But we have to, I think, recognize that there is not just a blind spot concerning this issue, there is also often, I think, an atmosphere of hostility to the idea that Christianity has made any serious contribution to freedom. One source of this hostility is the view of the Enlightenment. Edward Gibbon is a good example of the idea that Christianity not only contributed very little to freedom, but was intolerant. It was actually a fanatical ideology or religion that did not contribute to freedom. And I'll just begin with one brief quote from the first volume of Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in which Gibbon says this: "So intimate is the connection between the throne and the altar that the banner of the church has very seldom been seen on the side of the people." This panel, in a way, will suggest that thesis needs to be complicated, that, in fact, there were many, many instances in which the church was on the side of the people and of the freedom of the people. And to begin this conversation, we have outstanding experts who are more than capable of covering the first 1,000 years of Christianity. I will not read their bios extensively. You have all of their biographies in your program. You also have summaries of their papers as well in the program. And as Tom Farr said, you also have their papers on your flash drive. I will just briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Robert Louis Wilken on my far right, who is the William Kennan Jr. Professor of the History of Christianity Emeritus at the University of Virginia. He's also a distinguished fellow at the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. He's the author of many, many, many books. Most recently, he's the author of, appropriately enough, The First 1,000 Years, a global history of Christianity, published just about a year ago with Yale University Press. It would make a great Christmas gift, so you might consider buying a copy, still very much in print. And we also have Elizabeth Depalma Digeser to my immediate left, who is department chair and professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Professor Digeser is the author of two outstanding books on early Christian contributions to religious toleration and freedom, focusing on Lactantius and also focusing on the context of persecution in early Christianity. To my immediate right, we have John Rist, an outstanding philosopher, an expert on early Christian philosophy, an expert on Augustine, an expert on Plato. His most recent book is Plato's Moral Realism, The Discovery of the Presuppositions of Ethics. He has another book coming out in about a year, also with Cambridge University Press, on Augustine. And then to my far left, we have Ian Christopher Levy, professor of historical theology at Providence College. Professor Levy is an eminent scholar of medieval Christian thought, has numerous publications, including Holy Scripture and the Quest for Authority at the End of the Middle Ages, the Bible and Medieval Tradition, a companion to the Eucharist in the Middle Ages, and a couple of books at least on John Wycliffe. But to begin, I want to turn to Robert Wilken, who is an outstanding, eminent scholar of early Christianity, of patristics, but has in the last few months actually widened his study of Christianity and freedom to include the entire history of Christian thought up through the early modern period. And I want to first ask Professor Wilken, the idea, Professor Wilken, of religious freedom is certainly a very radical idea. The idea that every single human being, regardless of background or belief, possesses a right to be free from coercion in religious matters. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, many people, I think, if not most people, view this idea as an achievement of modernity. It's an achievement of the Enlightenment. But you have a different view on this, Professor Wilken. Where did this idea really come from? What are the deepest roots of this idea?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. One never pays much attention to what part of the program you put on, but then when you show up at something like this, you realize that the really exciting stuff, it just happened, and then you have to come back and start talking about the past. Sort of from the real to the imaginary, or maybe more accurate, from the immediacy to something of remembrance. So I think my task is first just to quote some text to you that some of you may have never heard. This morning, the Archbishop Mamberti mentioned the Edict of Milan. We have to call it the so-called Edict of Milan because it wasn't an edict and it didn't come from Milan. But it was actually a letter, and it came from Nicomedia. But in that particular document, the sentence that the emperors grant to all persons liberty to follow whatever form of devotion they wish. Those ideas, as Elizabeth Digeser has shown in her book, derive from a Christian Latin writer by the name of Lactantius, who was a Christian apologist writing at the beginning of the 4th century. And he was a confidant of Constantine. And he wrote, "The worship of God requires full commitment. It is something that comes from within and is something which is distinctive to an individual person." And from this, Lactantius draws the corollary that religion must spring from a free act. And then he says, religion cannot be coerced. It is a matter to be dealt with by words, not by blows, for it has to do with the will. And that's precisely what the Archbishop this morning said, that the key idea is that religion is a matter of the will, and it therefore cannot be coerced. Further, he says, nothing is so much a matter of free will as religion, for if the mind of the worshiper turns away, it is carried off, and nothing remains. Lactantius actually is following what was written a century earlier by another apologist, a better known name, the Latin apologist by the name of Tertullian. Tertullian, when the Christians in Carthage were being persecuted by the Roman governor Scapula around the year 211, he wrote this. He said that the nature of religion is that it's a person's natural right, he uses the word jus in Latin, or human right and natural endowment. And therefore, it is a matter of free choice, and therefore cannot be coerced. And then in another treatise, and I think this is probably the most extraordinary thing, he again talks about religion as something that comes from within, and he says to this Roman governor, he says, you must do nothing, he says, to take away from people their freedom of religion, libertas religionis. So the first occurrence of the term freedom of religion is in a Latin Christian church father writing around the year 200. Now what happens is that these two statements, or these two authors, their writings are really not cited by many people who follow after them, though the principle is one that is passed on. So that if you go to around the year 600, you go to Pope Gregory the Great, the question comes up about the forced baptism of Jews. He cites this same basic principle. It also then occurs in other writers, and then in the Middle Ages, you find it developed somewhat in Thomas Aquinas. The story, though, that I am now pursuing is that these two authors and these passages and some related passages surface in the 16th century. In people, first, who are concerned with the problem of dissenters because of the changed social situation. Someone like the Calvinist jurist, Johannes Althusius, he's one of the first persons to use the phrase liberty of conscience. And he uses it in the context of people who are being forced to leave the territory in which they live, are not able to practice the confession that they want. Another person is the French political philosopher Jean Bodin. And these people then quote these writings from the early Christian fathers. Then the English Baptists, people like Thomas Helwys, Leonard Busher, John Merton, also then quote these same texts and make an argument, a principled argument, not a matter of toleration, for religious freedom. Merton is influential then on Roger Williams, and Roger Williams actually quotes the passage from Tertullian that I quoted here in his Bloody Tenet. It's also quoted by William Penn. The point being that and the other thing that enters in the 16th century is the notion that there are two realms. There's a realm of the spirit where the sword is inappropriate, and there's the realm where the sword is appropriate. So those three basic ideas: religion is something from within, therefore it cannot be coerced, and there are two realms. Those are really at the heart of what John Locke says, though John Locke himself does not quote these particular writers. So basically what I want to argue is that there is a long lineage of ideas that were only possible because of Christianity. The text that I would quote, of course, is from the Old Testament in this case, is the Psalm. What is it that God requires? A contrite spirit, and a broken spirit and a contrite heart. That is something that comes from within. At the end of my paper, I note something that Shah and I have talked about, and actually he noticed for the first time. Thomas Jefferson actually quotes the passage from Tertullian. It's interesting, in his book on Virginia, in his own private copy, he wrote out the passage in Latin that religion cannot be coerced and it's a matter of a natural right, writes it out at the bottom in Latin, and I found that particular book of his in the Library of Congress where he had actually underlined it and put an X in the margin. Now, my point is not that he was drawing on Tertullian. I think he was using him as an authority. But the point is simply that there are ideas here that are at work that in a way remain largely underground for a good part of the tradition that begin to surface in the 16th century, and then they take on a whole new life. That's basically my...
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wilken. So, in a sense, if religious freedom, as we understand it today, has three basic ideas: the idea that there is a right, that everyone has it, and that this right that everyone has is to a freedom from coercion, a freedom to have the religion according to their own conscience. All those ideas are already in the early church fathers. Is that right? A universality?
The one that was not there is the notion that there are two realms. But then later, in terms of medieval Christianity, that does become part of the background. Mm-hmm. But the basic notion, at least as it developed, and then maybe I just make one further point. The significance of it, especially I think today, when people write books such as Why Tolerate Religion, is that...
Brian, an American law professor, Brian Leiter, has written a book called Why Tolerate Religion at All.
Why Tolerate Religion, is that the notion there is one that is fundamentally a religious notion. It has to do with the nature of God. And so that's really what Madison is talking about.
Great, thank you very much. I want to turn now to Elizabeth Digeser, who has done outstanding work excavating, as it were, the early history of Christianity as a persecuted minority, but also she has done outstanding work uncovering the roots of Christianity's response to that persecution. And I'd like to ask you, Professor Digeser, a little more about Lactantius. Professor Wilken mentioned Lactantius briefly. Why is Lactantius important, and how did he contribute to early Christian responses to persecution?
Well, as Professor Wilken ably discussed, Lactantius wasn't the first Christian author to think about a concept of religious toleration or religious liberty, which, in fact, he talks about both things. But because Tertullian had thought about this earlier, but he was the person who really developed it the most systematically and thought about not just how religious liberty might play out for the Christian population, why it was a need for the Christian population, which was pretty obvious during a time of persecution, but he also thought about the greater political project. He had a concept of what the state might look like if it were Christian, and in his way of thinking, a Christian state should also be a tolerant state. In fact, should offer religious liberty. So in order to see how these play out, I thought what I would do in a few minutes is to sketch a short history of the policy of religious liberty in the Roman Empire, in which Lactantius plays a very intimate part. This is significant, even though we just heard such a wonderful panel on what's going on in the world today. The experience of the Roman Empire with the problem of religious liberty is important because this is really the first documented case in the world where such a policy was implemented. And as Professor Wilken just mentioned, it was clearly an inspiration for later European political thought, and from Europe then into the rest of the world. So what I'd like to do in a few minutes is to look at why it came about and why it was so short. I think you mentioned Gregory, but there was a period between Constantine and Gregory when religious liberty was a little bit sketchy. So those are the two issues I'd like to talk about. In the year 303, the Emperor Diocletian issued 4 edicts of persecution, which took effect throughout the Roman Empire. And at that time, Diocletian was head of a college of 4 emperors, each of whom had responsibility for a different quadrant of the world. So the persecution unfolded at different speeds and different intensities in different parts of the empire for about 8 years, until in the year 311, the Emperor Galerius, Diocletian's successor, tried to end the persecution. He issued an edict from the city of Sofia in Bulgaria, an edict of tolerance, and he tried to stem the persecution that had been raging around him. Unfortunately, Galerius' colleague in the East refused to listen, so the persecution continued in some places, and Galerius died before he could rectify the situation. The very next year, the Emperor Constantine, ruling at this time in the northwest, moved south to Rome to fight against the emperor ruling in the southwest. And Constantine defeated that emperor at the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which took place not far from here. It's famous because, as the stories say, it was just before this battle, that Constantine in a dream was instructed by God to paint the sign of Christ on his soldiers' shields, and so his victory he attributed to the Christian God, and so historians generally mark the time of Constantine's conversion to this event. In 313, Constantine, so the year after his victory to become ruler of the West, in 313, Constantine met with one of his eastern colleagues, Licinius, to issue this famous so-called Edict of Milan, 1700 years ago. And so it's this event that we really commemorate with this conference, the 1700th anniversary of this edict, which was the first ever to guarantee religious liberty. And unlike the former edict of toleration 2 years earlier, this edict was enforced. Licinius moved east against Maximin Daia, the emperor in the east, who had continued to persecute, defeated him, and so for the next 11 years, Constantine and Licinius shared power, Constantine in the west, Licinius in the east, in a state of religious liberty. In 324, Constantine achieved sole rule. He was kind of an aggressive emperor. He moved east against Licinius and defeated him and came to bring the whole Roman world into his hands. In the very same year, he issued an edict to the eastern provincials, which seems to step back from his policy of religious liberty toward a position of religious toleration. Before we can talk about why this experience of religious liberty in the Roman Empire had such a brief life, we need to see why it existed at all. Obviously, Constantine was a key player in the seemingly short story of religious liberty in the Roman Empire, but why did the policy emerge at all? Well, as Professor Wilken has already foreshadowed, a prominent influence on the Emperor Constantine was the theologian Lactantius. He was a North African professor of Latin rhetoric who had witnessed Diocletian's call to persecution in 303. In fact, he was living in the capital city of Nicomedia where the edicts were issued, and he lived through the first several years of the persecution there at Ground Zero. He then joined Constantine's court a couple of years before Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. And in this interval between the edicts of persecution and joining Constantine's court, Lactantius wrote his Divine Institutes, which set out his arguments for religious liberty. Of course, as we've already seen, Lactantius drew on the earlier North African theologian Tertullian, but was much broader in application. We see Lactantius's fingerprints in Constantine and Licinius's edict, which is, in fact, a paradigmatic statement of religious liberty. As Professor Wilken already said, the edict states clearly that Christians and all others have liberty to follow that type of religion which appears best to them. And the Latin phrase is libera potestas, free power literally, but really a kind of autonomy. A kind of authority to pursue what your goal is. Now, people used to say that in 313, Constantine, as a Christian emperor, would actually have made Christianity Rome's only legal religion, but he was restrained by the pagan Licinius. And here you see some of Gibbon's sort of prejudice toward Christianity, assuming that Christianity is inherently intolerant. So this kind of paradigm assumes that Christians would repress religious freedom. And I think this point of view also misunderstands the significance of the words libera potestas in the edict. Because for Lactantius, as we've already seen, Constantine's courtier, it is religion alone in which freedom, libertas, has placed its dwelling. He says this specifically. Nothing requires free will so much as religion. So I think it's very easy to make a direct bridge from what Lactantius's arguments were in the Divine Institutes to the language in the Edict of Milan. So instead of a pagan pressuring the Christian Constantine to go easy on other beliefs, the evidence really is that Constantine had access to a principled point of view in favor of toleration, religious liberty. And when we look at the way Lactantius uses the word libertas, we can see that among its many senses, he used the one which meant true political freedom. For example, in the Divine Institutes, he says that people need libertas in order to choose virtue and correct belief. You can't be virtuous unless you are in a state of libertas. So this is a political and a religious concept. Moreover, he says you have to protect libertas. You can't interfere with anyone, otherwise you will jeopardize the state. So even if somebody gets advice about how to practice their beliefs, that someone can feel like his libertas is being denied. I mean, this is a very powerful statement. Finally, he then flips it on top of its head. Well, what if you have libertas and you want to interfere with somebody else? Lactantius says if libertas goes on the attack itself, instead of just resisting attackers, then it becomes bullying. So it's a very, I mean, this is not, he doesn't develop this systematically, but he leaves these clues throughout the text as to what he really thinks. So it seems that if you're in a state of religious liberty, you really must leave people alone. Otherwise, they can't be virtuous. Otherwise, they lack the conditions for genuine belief. Now, Constantine, I would say, was predisposed to accept this line of argument. His own father in Christian sources didn't enforce Diocletian's edicts much, so I think he was already primed to feel this way. And yet, when Constantine assumes sole rule in 324, he seems to have retreated from this position toward a position of tolerance, so thus ending this period of religious liberty. In 324, he issues an edict to the Western provincials, and he says, some people are saying that the customs of the temples being sacrifice, and the powers of darkness have been taken away with Licinius's defeat. I would have advised this very thing to all people, he says, if the powerful rebelliousness of that wicked error had not frozen in the souls of some people. Why this retreat? Why this language of hostility, which connotes a sense of tolerance? He's clearly not liking polytheism. Is there really something inherently intolerant about Christianity as a monotheistic faith? I would say no. Let's look at the audience here. Constantine is talking in this edict to other Christians. They are the ones who want to end the practices in the temples. And so what I would say we have here is a cautionary tale. If the Edict of Milan set a world precedent as the first public articulation of religious liberty, the Edict of 324 illustrated publicly for the first time two factors always in tension with religious liberty. One, no religious group is immune from the temptation to persecute, even a group who had recently suffered persecution itself. And two, finally, a state of religious liberty is very difficult for a doctrinally committed ruler to maintain if he also needs to maintain his credibility or prove his identity among his own group. So I'll leave things right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Digeser. That was marvelous. We've in a sense now taken a journey of about, 150 years or 100 years or so from Tertullian in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries to about 100 years later to Lactantius in the late 3rd, early 4th centuries. And we've taken a journey from a Roman policy that began to emerge of indulgentia, of toleration, which was not implemented really very effectively by Galerius, to a full-blown policy of religious liberty, as you very compellingly argued. Now, though, the story gets complicated. Professor John Rist is going to complicate the story a bit because 100 years after Lactantius or so, we have the great St. Augustine. And very famously, St. Augustine, another North African theologian, like Tertullian and Lactantius, comes along and he complicates things a bit, doesn't he? Amidst a schism that threatened to overwhelm the Catholic Church in North Africa, he theologically justifies some forms of religious coercion under some circumstances. And I'd like to ask John Rist to explain a bit the context that led Augustine to make this reversal of Christian teaching, because there had been a kind of consensus in the early church on religious liberty. And also, could you tell us, John Rist, was Augustine's embrace of religious coercion in some cases fully faithful to Augustine's own theology? Two very small questions. Professor Rist, I should say, is on record with me as resisting the idea that he can summarize these answers in 8 to 10 minutes. So, but I'm sure he's capable. So,
let me start then with a couple of cynical axioms. That is, when you're strong, you persecute to some degree. When you're weak, you talk about freedom. Now, in the longer version of my paper, what I'm going to say is to give some reasons why Augustine, who is probably the most influential Christian since Paul, thought that there may be circumstances in which heretics, at least, should be persecuted. I can't in a few minutes explain the subtleties of this claim, and it's well argued. All I can do is make a few comments relevant to why Augustine thought what he did, and why, perhaps self-referentially, he got it wrong. So 5 points to begin with. 1, in the ancient world, pagan or Christian, on the whole, it didn't matter much what you do to really bad guys. They have no rights. Indeed, the whole modern concept of rights is irrelevant to most ancient thinking. The second point, in punishing these bad guys, however horrendously, it's not normally thought that this is harmful to the punishing agent. So you need to show that such is the case if you want to show that brutality against the wicked is a bad thing. In other words, it's a question of protecting your own fragile virtue rather than somebody else's rights. Third, later on, for historical reasons, people began to think of freedom not as Augustine and the ancients generally did, but simply as being liberated from some sort of tyranny, real or imagined, of the church or churches or the state, or ultimately from God. In Augustine's view, generally speaking, and this is shared widely in antiquity, pagan as well as Christian, to be free in the strict sense is to be necessitated. That is, to be only able to do what is good. And finally, a more personal note for Augustine qua bishop, it really mattered to an ancient bishop what sort of soul somebody died with. I emphasize this because I don't think it matters quite so much to bishops now. It really mattered to ancient Christians what sort of soul you died with. A bishop would be called to account by God if he had neglected his flock in this manner. Apparently good reasons then for a spot of persecution. So where did Augustine's persecutory pose come into conflict with his more basic beliefs? First, over his account of human life after the fall of Adam. Here's the crucial point. If he is to maintain the basic claim that all of us are created in God's image, he might have to admit, and he doesn't believe in total depravity, of course, he might have to admit that we are possessed of a slightly more risky version of libertarian freedom than he often implies. Hence, the further question will be, what kind of human help can we be legitimately given by Christians, and especially by bishops, so that we may readily reach the eschatological goal that God has allotted to us? Are any means feasible or allowable? If so, then religious persecution, especially of heretics, would be justified. Though, of course, in the contemporary world, unfortunately, from this point of view, rarely a practical option for Christians. The first immediately plausible reason for ruling out religious persecution would then be that it excessively compromises the integrity of the image of God present in the individual persecuted. His essence as an image depending on the awesome capacity to be at least minimally able to choose for himself. In the Middle Ages, Duns Scotus seems to have opted for some such metaphysical claim. But what would Augustine's reaction to it be? First, he might wonder whether in putting this proposal to him, we have failed to comprehend the dreadful significance of right and wrong choices, of being numbered among the sheep or among the goats, being now unwilling or unable to view man's fate in such eschatological terms. Yet granting a degree of truth to that response, we can still remind Augustine that when thinking of pre-fallen Satan and Adam, he speaks with a different voice, proposing a position more like that which I attributed to Duns Scotus as the best available way of understanding what an image of God would have to be. Here's a passage from the City of God. God bestowed on those intellectual natures, i.e. angels, a power of free choice such that they might forsake God if they wished to do so. Might, that is, relinquish their blessedness and receive misery as the immediate consequence. And he knew that in their pride some of the angels would indeed wish to be self-sufficient for their own blessedness and hence would forsake their true good. Yet he did not deprive them of the power to do this. For he judged it an act of greater power and goodness to bring good even out of evil than to exclude the existence of evil. And God also made man righteous with the same freedom of choice. God foresaw that man would sin, yet he did not deprive man of his freedom of choice. But if Augustine thinks that man's dignity as an image of God requires us, or some of us, to learn the eschatological facts of life, and thus secure our own ultimate perfection, the hard way, he should also allow, A, that any man's dignity requires some sort of libertarian will, I use the word will in quotes incidentally, and B, that it's not beyond God's power substantially to restore such will even in our present life. He should further admit that only if he is unwilling to accept such an estimate of what is required to ensure that the integrity of the image of God is protected despite the sin of Adam, would he be right to advocate almost any degree of pressure to secure religious orthodoxy. While if he accepts it, his original account of what was necessary for human dignity for unfallen Adam must to some increased degree also apply in our fallen state. So the possibility of religious freedom would depend on whether God's idea of man's original dignity was in error, which Augustine presumably can't admit, and whether to retain it, God must be seen to allow an even slightly less disastrous effect of the fall on current humanity. But if Augustine ought to accept that much, and we know that he accepted God's willingness to let some people freely fall, even irrevocably, all that remains to be determined is which pressures, and there must be some, can appropriately be put on heretics or others to conform, and which not, man being in a better condition if he has a certain option of choosing the bad. We would perhaps approach this problem by appealing to rights, tying the concept of the image of God, as has been done certainly clearly since Locke, to the claim that we are the possessors of rights given to us by God. Note this, incidentally. People now want Locke's conclusions without Locke's premises, and recognizing such possession as an essential part of our being individually in the divine image. But though direct rights talk will get us nowhere with Augustine, there is an indirect reproach which he might find it more difficult to discount, and which depends on the philosophically more plausible notion that rights claims, even if theoretically based, are intelligible only in terms of the old idea that our primary duty, after loving God above all things, is to look after our own virtue. For only when thus concerned can we love our neighbour, of course in God, as ourselves, thus recognizing in modern language his rights. So we can challenge Augustine precisely on the ground that he's incoherently underestimated what is required to maintain and promote our own, and therefore others', moral well-being. And in that, it will not only be Augustine who is challenged, for I noted earlier that the standard assumption in antiquity and in many succeeding centuries, both Christians and pagans, was that acting brutally to the wicked will do no necessary harm to the agent. But Augustine should not allow such an impression to go unchallenged. It seems to be an empirical mistake, and no one is more convinced than Augustine that his tragically bleak account of the human condition is empirically based and observable. Hence we can tell him precisely qua bishop that he should not persecute, less because he might infringe on somebody's rights, though we might still agree and claim that he would be doing that, than because if he persecutes, he not only tries to enforce love, which he claims to be impossible, but that he also diminishes his own hope of attaining the moral excellence and happiness which he knows that with God's aid, in accordance with God's original intention, he is in obedience and love bound to pursue. Augustine might reply that that's a strong argument against certain forms of persecution, perhaps anything involving, say, physical damage like loss of a hand or something of the kind, but it's not an argument against any form of what some might choose to call persecution. He might point out that by the same argument as I've used there, any criminal could claim that he shouldn't be, quote, persecuted for doing the wrong thing. Stealing, committing perjury, or even killing, especially if the victim's unborn and can't personally claim his or usually her rights. That, however, would be a sophistic objection, and our answer would be exactly that which our hypothetical Augustine might try to ridicule, that the heretic must be let off not only with the most urgent caution we can muster, otherwise we shall find not only which would be damaging the persecuted, but even more fundamentally, we should be damaging ourselves as persecutors. That reply should satisfy Augustine, since it squares with his tragic account of human life. For whatever the rightness of the inscrutable justice of God, in the last resort, the image of God must retain a certain minimal scope qua image to pursue his own dignity and destiny, whithersoever it may tragically lead him. Hence, if our current version of Christianity is also willing to pay the price for that, Augustine would have to agree that we've learnt from the experience of history, and above all from the historical failure to establish a wide-ranging Societas Christiana, that in the hidden nature of things, though a good cause can be made for persecution, it's been tried and properly found wanting in the course of Christian experience for both persecutor and persecuted. No consequentialist arguments about the possible religious good for the children to be obtained by persecution of their fathers are strong enough to defeat that, so that Augustine would have to allow, on his own principles, that in developing a greater understanding that caeteris paribus, note that, caeteris paribus, we should not persecute for religious reasons, we have recognized with hindsight, and largely against our will, one of the greatest goods given to us by the divine providence. But there is that caeteris paribus. We won't allow the common criminal to claim immunity from, quote, persecution initiated in response to the material, and possibly by implication also spiritual, harm that he has done us. We tell him that in punishing him for what he has done is not persecuting. Similarly, there seem to be at least two sorts of cases where past and present Christian activities liable to be denounced as persecution must be denied to be such. In the first case, and here Augustine will be unambiguously with us, as would incidentally John Stuart Mill, we should not accept the acid throwing of the ultra donatus, or widow burning, human sacrifice, or female circumcision should be protected when and because they are part of a religious structure. Nor that, for that matter, that paedophile priests should be allowed to pursue their calling, because to stop them might, in some places and behind a veil of ignorance, impede the proper activity of duly constituted religious authorities, or indeed the practice of religion itself. For these are cases where the natural law written in our hearts, as Paul put it, and especially in religious matters, should tell us that any Christian believing in eternal and not merely man-made law must recognize that despite possible political inconvenience and disingenuously ecumenical appeals to the contrary, we should, where possible, persecute, in quotes, those whose understanding of religion condones these or other relevantly similar activities. And there is a second case, an analysis of which bears comparison with what we find when we try to reconstruct a theory of the just war, namely the correct attitude to be adopted to a religion which avowedly wishes to persecute our own. Here, as in just war theory, we should not allow potential persecutors to avoid censure and possibly, where appropriate, the use of force in cases where we can legitimately appeal to self-protection. In that sense, originally at least, the Crusaders were right. No religion, that is, should be allowed to assert, as unfortunately Christians, including Augustine, have asserted in the past, that we have the right to persecute you, but you have no right to defend yourselves by reasonable means, including, if necessary, force, against our persecution. In hard cases, religious freedom must remain a reciprocal affair, and it's mischievous, or worse, to be one-sided, perhaps by comparing the appropriate attitude of a religious society as a corporate individual toward other such corporate individuals with the possibly correct behavior of private individuals in some personal quarrel. If I may sum it up, if for religious reasons a Christian is kicked in the ass simply because he's a Christian, he has no obligation to turn the other cheek. I would certainly agree with Augustine about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rist. You've ironically given us an Augustinian case for religious freedom and religious self-protection as well. Well, we now complete our 1,000-year history in this very brief period with Ian Levy. Ian Levy, you take us right through the early medieval period, and of course it's widely believed that by the Middle Ages the Christian world moved even further from the radical ideas of religious freedom and liberty of conscience that were articulated by Tertullian and Lactantius, and in the early Augustine as well. We associate the Middle Ages with heresy trials, with the Inquisition. Of course, those are undeniable realities of the Middle Ages, but you argue that the situation was much more complicated, actually. Could you talk about how ideas of religious freedom and liberty of conscience actually continued to be found in this period?
Sure. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I looked at the period from about 1100 to 1400, and thus the idea of religious freedom and tolerance among the canon lawyers and the theologians. I would say two things. I think that there were twin pillars, if you will, that undergirded a sense of religious freedom and tolerance. First of all, canon law and theology recognized that belief cannot be coerced. So the act of faith is by definition a free assent of the rational will. And this is made very clear, therefore, in decrees by popes and the statements of theologians and lawyers, that there can be no forced baptism on, if you will, purely theological grounds alone, because, as I say, the act of belief must be a free assent of the rational will, albeit aided by divine grace. So that's number one. But number two, and perhaps even more foundational, is the idea of natural law, which undergirded a principle of natural rights. And indeed, I would argue very strenuously that the theory of natural rights, which develop into what we now call human rights, that these were developed, first of all, by the canon lawyers of the 12th century, who were already talking about a natural right as a certain power inherent within the individual to act in accord with right reason. These foundational rights that were guaranteed under natural law could not be abrogated for any reason, certainly by no positive law. Certainly no king, or for that matter pope, could abrogate the rights that every human being had under natural law. And nor could they be abrogated by divine law, the idea being that divine law, that which is revealed in the Old and then most perfectly in the New Testament, say with baptism, divine law was understood to build upon natural law. And of course the famous saying of Thomas Aquinas, which everyone would have agreed to at the time, that grace does not destroy nature, grace rather perfects nature. In other words, non-Christians have certain natural rights that even the good of divine law could not overcome. So let me look at this specific issue right now, perhaps illustrative of this, of the religious minority that lived within the boundaries of Christendom, namely Jews in medieval Europe. Beginning in 1120, the popes issued a series of decrees that made it very clear that Jews were entitled to worship, be unmolested in their worship, to have synagogues, and indeed refurbish their synagogues, even though it must be said they were not permitted to build new ones. Nevertheless, they could never be forcibly baptized, and this was made very clear. Moreover, their children could not be forcibly baptized. And I'll use an example again from Thomas Aquinas, saying something which many lawyers and theologians would have said. It was rather commonplace. The issue was whether the children, unbaptized Jewish children of Jewish parents, could be baptized against the wishes of their parents. And Thomas made it very clear that in this case, because the infants don't yet have the use of rational will, their parents will substitute in their place. And the children belong by natural law to the parents, and the parents' sense of what is good for the children. And therefore the children could not be baptized against the will of their parents. And I think this is very important, because what it recognizes here is that neither the church nor the state could, if you will, interfere or interfere within this sacred realm of the family, which was protected under natural law, even if it might be for the good, if you will, of the child in that sense. In other words, this could have been a pastoral question and it was taken for granted for Thomas Aquinas, his medieval contemporaries, as for St. Augustine, if it is true that unbaptized infants and all the unbaptized would indeed face eternal damnation, would it not be in the pastoral interest of the child to baptize him? Again, though, under natural law, the natural rights of the parents and the family preclude that. So that's one example. But I would also point out a strong emphasis in the medieval period on the common good. And this idea that medieval society was a corpus Christianum, and all of its citizens were ultimately destined for an eternal goal, and hopefully one of the beatific vision. And consequently, all rulers, ecclesiastical and secular, had an obligation. Indeed, kings were anointed, after all, by priests that they all had an obligation to see to it that those who were placed in their charge would in fact realize their supernatural goal. And in this sense, therefore, and perhaps later on we can talk about the issue of heresy and heresy trials, but I would say in this sense, we always have to place everything within that context, that no one was an entirely free actor in the medieval world. This was an understanding, as I say, of a common good which bound not only the lowest members of society, but indeed the highest. Indeed, the Pope himself could be deposed if he were seen to be acting against the common good. And this brings us back again to natural rights. Every body under natural law, and the church itself is a body, the body of Christ, has a right under natural law to preserve its own integrity, which meant that no ecclesiastical official, however powerful, was immune, therefore, from rebuke, even from a common university theologian like myself. And the reason I bring that up is that it stresses again the idea of freedom inherent within the Christian conception of religion, that a theologian, that a subordinate could, for the greater good of the church and for the sake of truth, indeed speak freely in this instance when the truth is at stake for the good of the larger body, and indeed had an obligation not only under evangelical law but under natural law as well. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. I'd like to ensure that we can have as many questions or comments as possible from the audience. I'd like us to go immediately into dialogue with the audience. So invite you to raise your hands. We have time before lunch at least. We've got about 15 minutes or so, a little more than that, before lunch at 1 o'clock. So I'd like to use the time for discussion. Any comments? Yes, sir. Could you go to just give it a turn on your, yeah. Oh. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I do understand that there is a kind of underground river from Tertullian on of religion freedom in Christianity. The point is that it has not always been possible to implement it. Now my question is the following. Because you said something that I didn't know, that this river spilled over in the 16th century, the century which has been the most violent because of struggle within Christianity. And maybe that thanks to this struggle we arrive at a certain principle which in Latin is called cuius regius eius religio, which is not exactly religious freedom, but something that could help in this direction. My question is, without the contribution of atheists, of those who think that God does not exist, and the French Revolution in particular, would it have been possible for Christianity to implement politically the freedom of religious principle, which from Tertullian on was a kind of underground river? Thank you.
Was your question directed to anyone in particular, or?
Yes. As I said at the beginning, but the microphone was not working, to Professor Wilken.
Okay, yes, great, thank you, that's what I thought, thank you.
Well, I think the point that I was trying to make was that in the 16th century, a wholly new social situation arose, which had not ever been the case, where you had communities of people who made a different confession than the region in which they were living. The response initially on those who speak on behalf of the authorities, people like Althusius or Jean Baudin, is that these people, there has to be a way to find that they can live among us. because there's no way in which they can be removed, or there's no way in which we can suppress them. The assumption, of course, was that there was a common faith, and that was what held together. The vinculum societatis was religion. And that then began to provide a wider context, especially during the reign of King James in England. The English Baptists begin to make, in principle, arguments that there has to be a recognition of the liberty of conscience, which was recognized by people like Baudin and Althusius. And these then become the basis of the arguments that are going to be presented in the 17th and the 18th century. So there's no question that Christian thinkers and Christian leaders then begin to implement something that was not present before, but was there certainly long before the French Revolution or even John Locke. As the great British intellectual historian Promenade said, it was not the skeptics, it was not the irreligious, it was the religious people who argued for these things because they took seriously religion. And so that the whole sort of narrative has to be reversed. It's the religious people who make the argument for religious freedom, not the skeptics.
Yes, sir. And could I ask you to please identify yourself before you ask your question or make your comment? Yes, yes. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I'm Mobin Shahid, and I'm a phenomenologist of religion, as my field is philosophy. So I would like to ask a question from Professor Elizabeth Depalma, and I liked very much the reflection, especially as far as the question of historical developments is related. It was very interesting. But I was questioning myself in guidance with your reflection. You see, in history, it seems polytheism and monotheism started from religious experience. This is anthropological data. No? And all the three monotheistic religions had an aggressive attitude towards the natural religions around them. Even if it is true that Christianity had rather this experience when it went to the other territories instead of where it really originated. Now, even if it is true that the faith in one God, you see, or this so-called henotheism is present also in other natural religions in different forms. Even sometimes it is called supreme power. I would rather use this expression of Gerardus van der Leeuw. No? So what would you think of this dimension of monotheistic attitude with aggression towards natural religious attitudes? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a question that often comes up, and it's an important question. And if I understand you correctly, the question really is asking, isn't there something about belief in one God that that leads us to be more repressive and aggressive, especially towards more indigenous traditions that might be polytheistic? And I guess I would say, if you look at the history of the world today, it is absolutely true that the world's monotheisms have lapsed into this kind of aggressive behavior on a sadly all too frequent occasion. But I think what we could also do is broaden our focus. And if we look just at the Roman Empire, which is the world I know best, I would say that polytheism itself is not necessarily naturally tolerant. So the Romans were very clear about the kinds of things that they liked and they didn't. Polytheism is elastic. It can easily, to a certain extent, incorporate deities that aren't in conflict with its practices, but even the Romans knew what they didn't like. For example, in the 2nd century BC, they shut down the Bacchic rites because they didn't like that men and women were worshiping together and that people were drinking a lot. I would also say that we, within the narrative of Christianity, we can see these two aspects in conflict. And, sadly, it's true that in the later empire, it was more repressive. However, even in the Byzantine period, at least up until the 6th century, Jews continued to be protected and tolerated, officially tolerated. So it's a very nuanced story. And when we look at the rise of Islam, when Islam comes into the late antique world, in fact, it's in many cases the Islamic armies are invited into places like Alexandria because they're more tolerant than the Byzantine rulers. So it's as Gibbon was right that there is an aggressive strain in Christianity, but it isn't only Christianities and it isn't only monotheisms, I would say.
And
Thank you.
just to follow up, this is a very important point, and I'd like to ask you about this, Elizabeth. We discussed in the previous panel that one of the reasons that Christians today are often persecuted is because Christians assert that the church or Christian communities are independent, or should be, of the state. Did this have something to do with Roman lack of tolerance towards the early Christians? In other words, one of the things the Romans may not have liked about Christianity, and even Edward Gibbon picks up on this a bit in his famous last 2 chapters of Volume 1 of the History of the Decline and Fall, that Christians asserted an independence that the Roman authorities really couldn't quite be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true, and I think it was an aspect of Christianity that was destined to come to the surface quickly, because in the Roman state, the state was a religious institution. So if you were a citizen, you had an obligation, a kind of unwritten requirement to participate in the civic rights of the state, and otherwise people assumed you weren't a good citizen. You weren't doing your job to uphold the divine sanction. And as Christians pushed against that religiously, they couldn't help but push against the state. And so I think in that crucible, you do see this push against the power of the state that becomes a part of the Christian core.
If Caesar is God, Christians were asserting an autonomy, as it were, vis-a-vis that.
Yeah.
Yes, we have a question here. Please identify yourself first.
Sì. Marta Cristiani, docente all'Università Urbaniana. Posso parlare italiano perché è un po' complesso. Dunque, anzitutto ringrazio Jan Levy per aver nominato il grande Alcuino, che è uno dei modelli dell'intellettuale europeo, e vorrei ricordare che Alcuino protesta contro il battesimo forzato dei sassoni conquistati da Carlo Magno in una sua lettera molto significativa, quindi è su questa posizione. Nello stesso tempo vorrei introdurre un elemento critico in questa bellissima sessione che ho seguito con grande interesse e che avrei voluto sentire anche la voce del cristianesimo greco, dove il problema della libertà si pone all'interno di un forte potere imperiale che rivendica la sua diretta origine divina e le grandi tensioni teologiche e spirituali che sono presenti. Vorrei ricordare Massimo il Confessore, che è uno dei martiri della propria libertà di pensiero teologico. Grazie.
Thank you very much. First, let me say that Elizabeth Pradramu, who will be speaking later, will have some discussion of Greek Christianity. So we will hear more about that. On your first point about the objections to the forced conversion of the Saxons, would you like to comment on that?
Well, you mentioned Alcuin, and of course, you mentioned Alcuin, and Alcuin, who was his primary advisor on matters of this sort, wrote a strong letter protesting that this was wholly against Christian principles.
Sì, sì.
I mean, I think
Sì, sì.
Alcuin should be seen then as another testimony to the continuation of the tradition that begins with Tertullian. And he would be later, of course, almost 200 years later than Gregory the Great.
Can I make a point? Yes, please. Just also to follow up on this idea, I spoke of natural rights of minorities within Christendom. I want to make clear, especially in the 13th century, the Pope Innocent IV had been a very eminent canon lawyer prior to his elevation to the papacy. And he made it very clear that non-Christian societies had rights under natural law such that they could not be invaded without just cause, simply because their rulers were not in a state of grace. And I think this is very important, that there was an integrity, in other words, to non-Christian societies that had to be honored by the Christian societies in return. So once again, we see this principle. And then, of course, it becomes a huge issue in the early 16th century with Francis de Vittorio and de las Casas and the rights of the native peoples of the Americas, that they have a fundamental right under natural law to form their own societies, which cannot be abrogated for any reason. So once again, neither positive human law nor even divine law can eradicate the fundamental rights. I won't call them privileges, they're actually rights inherent in the human person based upon their basic human dignity. That was a fundamental principle spelled out very clearly already in the 13th century, and then, as Timothy Shah points out, resurrected, if you will, and applied again in the situation of the Americas in the 16th century.
Thank you very much. Professor Rist would like to comment.
Yes, a little historical note. We've heard about forced baptism. It's worth noticing that this was not the original issue. In other words, the question is not so much whether we should talk about persecution in general, but what sort of persecution should be involved. Professor Levy, for example, mentioned the position of the Jews in the Middle Ages. The Jews in the Middle Ages habitually appealed to popes against local bishops and lords because popes followed, interestingly enough in this matter, St. Augustine, who said they should not be persecuted, they should be left alone more or less. And this is known to the Jewish communities who appealed to Rome directly over the local authorities. So the issue is not simply broadly who should we persecute, but who should we persecute? And the original, as it were, breach, if you like, in the wall, which is one that I talked about in the case of Augustine, relates specifically to heretics. And that is a tradition which goes back in some sense behind Augustine. In fact, it goes back to Cyprian at least, and probably to Origen as well, in the form of the notorious phrase extra ecclesiam nulla salus. That phrase is often taken to be referring to what attitude we should have towards pagans, Jews, or whatever. But originally it was not intended to apply to any of those groups. It was aimed specifically at heretics, people who had departed from the so-called Great Church. So that in considering the history of persecution, one needs to look at that kind of question very sharply. In other words, originally persecution, as advocated by Augustine in some cases, is specifically aimed at heretics. He bans the persecution of Jews. He thinks that pagans should be left alone, except that if their cults are obscene or cruel or something of that kind, and there's no question of forced baptism. In other words, what we're looking at over the Christian period is a gradual expansion of the problem of the claims, should we or should not persecute. It's the beginning, as it were, in the ancient times, and it continues later on. And one should add furthermore that the problem changed radically in the 16th century, not only in the way that's been discussed already, but because in the 16th century, first of all, there are disputes within Christendom. We all believe in a Christian God in some way. That's the kind of appeal of the Baptists and so on are really talking about. But when someone like Grotius comes along, the issue is, what do we do when we're dealing with people who are not Christians at all? So that a good deal of modern rights theory, in fact, doesn't so much derive from debates within Christianity, but how can we find a code of rights which will fit all persons, whether they're Christians or not? not qua members of a group, not say members of a guild or a caste or anything, but everybody in some sense. That's the newer, I would say, issue, which does not occur very much, I would say, partly Professor Levy, in the Middle Ages, and it arises, I think, partly because specifically we're now beginning to move outside a specifically Christian world and are trying to find some way of dealing with people who are outside it.
But isn't it the case that you, Professor Levy, are in a sense asserting just the opposite, that actually you did have an early recognition of, as it were, a community of rights bearers that extended beyond the Corpus Christianum?
Yes, and in fact, if I could speak to the issue of rights, of course, the whole issue of natural rights is a very debated topic, and the question of objective and subjective rights would be something for another conference. But I would say a word also about rights with respect to heretics as they were treated in the Middle Ages. I would point out that, of course, heresy was a crime against the state in the Middle Ages. You were tried in ecclesiastical court, but any punishment that might ensue was carried out by the state. However, the accused had a number of rights, and those rights were rooted in natural law. The accused had a right to hear the evidence against him. He had a right to make a defense. In fact, the idea that you had a right to a defense and a right to a day in court was understood as rooted in the fundamental natural law of self-defense. And indeed, the right to hear the charges against you was seen likewise as a fundamental natural right. Moreover, just on the issue of heresy, I would point out that when Inquisition began in the 13th century, there was no Inquisition, if you will, with a capital I. Inquisitio was a judicial process that replaced earlier processes, one of which might be, for instance, trial by ordeal, which the church would no longer participate in by the early 13th century. So basically, in order for a heresy trial to proceed, there had to be so-called public fame. In other words, someone had to be disrupting their community to such an extent that an inquiry was opened up. At that point, the church would only inquire into the matter that caused the public fame. There's a famous expression in canon law that the church does not judge what is in secret. In other words, you only have to answer for the charges that are being laid against you that have been brought, as I say, because of some kind of public outcry. Anything else is left for the confessional, not for the inquisitorial board. And by the way, about 90% of anyone who appeared before a board of inquisitio went away with a penance. A heretic would have to be pertinacious in his defense of his heresy even after he had been shown that he was indeed contravening the dictates of the church. And again, I would point out, just lastly, that the Inquisition only applied to Christians. It could not, by definition, be applied to non-Christians, precisely because these were matters of Christian doctrine. But even there, as I say, the rights of the defendant were recognized by the canon lawyers.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more question or comment. Yes, at the back, yes.
Sì, devo parlare in italiano perché il inglese non sarebbe buono. E le mie questioni sono José Martín de Agar, professore all'Università della Santa Croce qui a Roma. Le mie questioni vanno dirette, penso, a tutti perché riguardano i concetti e vorrei chiarimenti. Da una parte penso il cristianesimo apporta alla storia del pensiero soprattutto l'idea che la religione non è una questione politica. Questo dualismo crea problemi al cristianesimo inizialmente con le persecuzioni, l'indipendenza, autonomia di cui parlava il professor Wilken, e poi invece quando diventa religione, prima religione libera e poi ufficiale, forse questa idea viene meno. E di questo vorrei chiedere al professor Rist l'idea di Sant'Agostino sul ricorso al braccio secolare e anche alla professoressa Depalma, Digeser, se non c'è una differenza per poter parlare delle radici le radici cristiane della libertà religiosa, se non c'è una differenza tra libertà di atto di fede e libertà religiosa. Sono cose che sono vicine, che hanno un collegamento chiaro, ma che non sono le stesse. Certo, nella difesa della libertà dell'atto di fede si trova una radice della libertà religiosa, ma c'è quell'altra clausola del primo emendamento americano che è la non status clause. Questa è di radici, a me sembra, però vorrei sapere le vostre opinioni, radice illuminista, cioè la separazione tra la Chiesa e lo Stato, perché nell'età moderna, quando di nuovo la religione comincia ad essere una questione politica, proprio perché l'affermazione della propria sovranità all'interno di ogni paese, di ogni regno in Europa richiede anche un'unità religiosa. E questo è una delle questioni, mi sono posto molte questioni proprio sentendo le vostre relazioni, di sapere se veramente era così o forse nella storia non era esattamente così. Grazie.
Thank you very much. Well, as I understood the questions, they were directed for really the whole panel. I mean, just if I may, on the question about separation of church and state, the independence of the church, Professor Wilken discussed this to some extent, and I've looked to some extent at a thinker that didn't come up today, Gelasius, who of course is famous for introducing the idea in his duo sunt, two swords or two rules idea, that in a way there has to be a kind of separation between church and state, and Gelasius roots this not in a kind of secular set of ideas. We tend to think this whole idea is a modern secular idea, but of course Gelasius roots the idea in a specifically Christological claim that Christ is the true and eternal priest-king, and therefore no human institution can carry out both the priestly and political functions that only Christ has the authority to combine. It's a profoundly theological and specifically Christological idea, and as Professor Wilken points out, this has developed, the idea that there are two realms, a realm of the spirit and a realm of the sword. That gets developed by a number of thinkers really throughout Christian history. Perhaps, Professor Wilken, you'd like to comment a little further on that or other questions?
The earlier history is, it really is something that emerges clearly in the 16th century, and so the distinction is between a civil realm that has to do with safety, property, these matters, and then there's a religious realm, a spiritual realm, and they are distinct and they have different authorities. I mean, but I think it finally goes back to the words of Jesus, but I mean, that's not really what it was earlier. It took the later development to.
There's a curious complication of this. If we think about Constantine, Professor Digeser will be able to say more, but it seems to me that Constantine's adoption of Christianity wasn't entirely religious, in the sense that his predecessor had also tried to find a religion which would bind the Roman Empire together. So you're going to get much more like the Caesar of Papism, as it were, which survived in Byzantium for quite a long time and did cease to exist in the West because of the collapse of the secular power. But it certainly was the case. They tried worship of the sun. They tried other things too. It very much was a notion of, as it were, to put it in crude terms, Ein Reich and Volk and Führer, and the facade began to crumble pretty quickly because Constantine put together the Council of Nicaea, which seemed to provide something which he wanted, that is a unified Christian belief, was noted absolutely furious that it didn't work that way. It's worth noticing that most of the bishops who were most prominent in Nicaea were in exile a few years after the council. In other words, Constantine was getting pretty fed up, as it were, with the fact that the Christianity wasn't providing this unity, this Caesar of Papist state, I would take it as being, which he really hoped to find. Forget about the donation of Constantine, of course, that's a medieval invention. What was going on in Constantine's own time seems to me much more like what was later going on in Byzantium, where in one sense the church was to be as it were, a ministry of religious affairs for a government. So when we think about what was going on in the late empire, that's certainly something that should be borne in mind.
I guess what I would add to this in the conversation about the separation of church and state and the role that belief plays in this is the history of the Roman Empire in the several centuries after Constantine's conversion is really a period of transition. I think that there isn't one overarching way of behaving, and I think that different emperors in different times and periods with different beliefs played a role in this transition. So you might have someone like Valentinian who had a hands-off approach to pretty much everything. You might have an emperor, his brother, ruling in the East, who was very hostile to heresy. And so these tensions, I think, allowed these ideas to play one against each other for a very long time, way up into the 6th century reign of Justinian, where he really did try to function as priest and king and didn't have very good luck with it.
Well, our tour of more than 1,000 years is now over. You can take a break. We have lunch waiting for us, and my colleague Tom Farr will say a bit about where lunch is located. But please thank the panel. You were all marvelous.